Hi there! If you're watching this video, it's because you're interested in the history of Westfield. And did you know that the Westfield Athenaeum has a huge collection of historic artifacts? One of the best ways you can help support Westfield history is by supporting the Westfield Athenaeum. And one of the easiest ways you can do that is by hitting the little subscribe and bell buttons right below this video. Check out our website for more content, and always follow us on all of our social media to see what we're doing. All of those links are going to be in the description below. Now join us for the second part of Dr. Bob Brown's Archives Dive.
One final comment on my earlier talk. Obviously, as this is St. Paddy's Day, representing all that is best from Ireland, it's rather strange to be giving a talk on the very group who wanted to exterminate all the best that's from Ireland. I mean, that's the reality. When you're talking about the Puritans, that's the reality. So we'll just have to go with it. In 1830, the Congregational Church was disestablished. Now, what that meant is up to 1830, the Congregational Church was an instrument of government, an instrument of society. The pastor was paid out of taxes. The upkeep of the church, the building of church and upkeeping of the church came from taxes. And at least in the first century, everyone had to attend that church. Didn't matter whether you weren't a Congregationalist, you had to attend that church. And it didn't matter what your beliefs were, you were taxed to support that church. The government stood behind that. It was the Puritan New England, because that's what the Congregationalists are. They're those happy people simple little folk who come over as pilgrims, and do nothing other than exterminate the Indians and take all the land. This church, for at least 200 years, was the very essence of society. The church and what it did and the people who were in it were the backbone of the economy, the backbone of the politics, the backbone of the culture. And there are many people who say that some of the things which are still a little unique about Massachusetts is still an outgrowth of that old Puritan congregational approach to life. Now, this was particularly strong in the 1600s. It was not quite as strong in the 1700s, and by the time we get to the early 1800s, the Congregational Church and its power have pretty much drifted away, which is why you could, under the new Congress, the new Continental United States, disestablish it. People weren't going to fight to keep paying their taxes to support that one church. Now, how do we know about all of this? Well, we have the church records here. Now, some of you got a chance to look early on. This big volume right here. This is the official church records from the foundation of the church in 1679 until 1834. The records open, and the page I had it open to the day the church was created. Now, I had to explain first off, that when I talk about the church, we're not talking about a building. We're talking about the group of saints, they were called. That is, those Puritans, those Congregationalists, who had proof that God approved of them. And that because God picked them, they could run everything. They were the saints. Well, how did you know? You had to have what the modern Protestant evangelicals call a rebirth. You had to have a religious experience where you gained this knowledge. But that wasn't all, because in modern evangelicals, you simply announce that you have this rebirth, and everybody says, oh yes. That's not the way it worked with the Puritans. What you had to do is you had to publicly describe that experience to those who already were saints. And they judged you. They decided whether they were going to believe you and let you into their exclusive little group. Now that's how this book opens. Because Edward Taylor, who had come as minister to Westfield in 1671, had for 8 years refused to create a church. Now that created all kinds of problems, because under Massachusetts rules at that point in time, you couldn't have a town unless you had a church. You had to have this group of believers, and he's refused to do it. Now it's not clear. No one knows why he refused. Obviously, King Philip's War intervened during those 8 years, and some people said he was busy at other things. But anyway, this opens when he gathers 13 men in town who had had this religious conversion, and each of them stands up and explains their conversion. He writes them down if he approves, and those 13 men founded the church. And their conversions are all here. He then goes on to keep the records of the church, as do his successors, until 1834. Now, Edward Taylor became nationally famous. So various scholars and researchers have done research on him, and none of you would really have allowed the personal access to this document that it would take to be able to read it, and you'd have difficulty reading it anyway. But if for some reason you're interested, a group of professional scholars about 50 years ago did transcribe all those records dealing with Edward Taylor. The books are here in the library. They're on the shelves. You can get them and you can read those records of his 60 years. Now, the rest of the pastors, and he ceased being in charge in the 1720s, from there until 1834, they've never been transcribed. So the records of the church for all the rest of the pastors are still there. They're unread. Now, that's not the only records we have. After Taylor left, the next pastor was a Reverend Bull. He kept a journal. Unfortunately, we don't have it, but it's at Old Deerfield. So you can follow his personal accounts. Taylor did not keep a journal. So we don't have his personal accounts outside of the church about what's going on in town. Bull did, and his journal's up at Deerfield. He was succeeded by the Reverend Ballantyne, and Ballantyne kept a journal, and he was here for over 30 years. That one you can have fun with, because Ballantyne's journal is very famous, and that has been transcribed. Now, we have the originals here up in the archive, but that has been transcribed. It's in typescript. There are copies here, and you can read his journal. It's from the 1760s, I think, to 1776. And you can read all the events that are going on in Westfield in his journal. So we have that to tell us what's happening. He was succeeded by the Reverend Atwater. And the Reverend Atwater also kept a journal. We have 8 years of it. Now, paper was very, very scarce and very, very expensive. So he took old almanacs and almanacs had blank pages in them. And he wrote his journal in the blank pages in the almanacs. We have 8 years of his journal. So again, you can get the official church records, and then you can get the commentary on what's going on in town. Now we have something else for Atwater. Each of these ministers had to make a living. What that meant in the 1600s and 1700s and the early 1800s, you're a farmer. And so each of these ministers had a home and a farm in town. And all the years they were here, they had to function as regular citizens. They had to keep records. Now, in those days, cash was extremely scarce. Most business was conducted by barter. I've got pigs. You've got an orchard. I trade you my pig for so many apples. Now, what we have to do is we have to agree that my pig is worth X amount. It's pounds, shillings, and pence. And I say, okay, it's worth 2 pounds, 3 shillings. And you say, all right, that sounds about right. Now, I want that equivalent in apples from you. Well, maybe the apple crop is bad this year. So you say, well, I can't provide you with apples, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll cut wood for your fireplace. And we got to keep records of this. And so people kept what researchers call day books. They're ledgers of double entry bookkeeping. You have the name of the person on the top, and on one side you write what I got from that person, translated into money, and on the other side you write what I gave to that person, translated into money, and at the end of the year, the two of us sit down and we balance the books. Now, these kinds of ledgers are wonderful insights into how the real world works. You see what people do for a living, you see the value of goods, you see the exchange, you see the interchange with the community, you get a wonderful insight. So in Reverend Atwater's case, we've got all of his financial records also. By the way, Atwater is in many ways the most interesting of these people. Atwater is a scientist. One of the things he does is he keeps records on the weather every day. And he records all phenomena, comets, and shooting stars, and earthquakes. We had a researcher a few years ago contact working on Thomas Jefferson's papers, who of course is obviously a very famous science dabbler. And they had records from Thomas Jefferson that Jefferson had been in contact with Atwater looking for some comments about a comet and wanted to know what we had on this side. Well, we didn't have anything on this side. But Atwater was a fairly well-known scientist. He was a big beekeeper also. And he experimented with silkworms and growing mulberry trees and trying to develop an industry in town weaving silk. I think it's kind of hard to believe that Westfield would become the center of a silk industry. It didn't, but he tried very hard. Now, we also have records of births, deaths, marriages, and membership in the church. One of the early 19th century pastors was the Reverend Emerson Davis. Davis was big in education. Some of you may know that Davis was active in the Westfield Academy in bringing the normal school to town. He was temporarily president of the normal school in its earliest days. He was an amateur historian, and he kept all kinds of records. So what he did is he recorded in these ledgers births, deaths, marriages, membership in the church, lists of members in the academy, and all other kinds of town records. So again, we have a pastor who builds the record base for the community, and it's here. And finally, we have something else. We have assorted pew lists. Now, this is something you may not know about. Up until the beginning or very early in the 19th century, you didn't just go to church and sit wherever you wanted. Now, in the late 19th century, the custom had developed that your family bought a pew, and that was your pew. Prior to that, the congregation was seated as a political decision. The good pews were in the front, the bad pews were in the back. I've not been able to understand whether the right-hand side was better than the left-hand side. I can't understand it. But a committee was established to assign your seat based on how important you were in the community. And this is a pew list for 1802. This one happens to have been written by Samuel Fowler. There's the Fowlers again. He's the father of James, the man I talked about the first day. And they decided who's important, who isn't important. And you can go to the bottom of this list and find out who doesn't count at all. It's easy. So we've got a whole variety of these. Obviously, that gets into controversy. There were battles over these pew lists. If you got demoted a seat or so, it became, because it would become very obvious to every other person in the congregation, because they know which the good seats are. So if you were in the front and got moved even one row back, suddenly everybody says, oh, you know what's happening. So we've got all this stuff. It's in here. Now, I see we have the pastor of the First Church, and I know there are other members of the First Church here. Just to get the record straight, the only one of these things that ever belonged to First Church is the records. But back about 80 years ago, the records were in terrible condition. And the leadership of the First Church, Congregational Church, and the leadership of this library, and the leadership of the Historical Society, and various other bigwigs in the town were some of these old Yankee families. They were the same people. And the library said to the church, look, we will pay to restore these documents. Send them out to professional restorers, get them put on silk paper, get them properly bound, get them taken care of. but they've got to be taken better care of than they have been for the last 250 years. So you must place them permanently in our possession. And that's why that's here. And we have the letters drawing that up. All right, so there's the records that you can work the history of the church, and you can work a lot of the history of the town. This becomes the official history of Westfield. Various researchers have used these documents, particularly the Reverend Lockwood, who writes that famous god-awful, dull, 2-volume history of Westfield. This is the official record. However, and this is where the modern historian comes in, there's another way of looking at those documents and looking at that history. First of all, remember those saints? There were very few of them. Church membership, that is, those people who ran things, there were very few of them. When this church was created in 1679, the population of Westfield was about 200 people. There were 98 adults above the age of 18. Only 31 of them, of whom 17 were males, were members of the church. When the Reverend Lockwood finished 50 years later, in 1729, the population of Westfield was about 450 people. There were 275 adults in town, but only 41, of whom 14 were males, were members of the church. Everybody else, by law, is required to go to the church and sit there and listen to the sermons, or you have to pay a fine. And everybody else is required to pay their taxes, to pay for the minister, and to pay for the building. But only those 14 men get to vote on anything. Now, needless to say, that doesn't make the rest of the people terribly happy. Now, very few were supported by the bulk of the population. What made it even worse is that the town was governed by regular meetings of all adult male holders of property. They called them freeholders. And they were required to show up and vote at every one of these town meetings. You would be fined if you didn't show up. The meetings were held 3 or 4 times a year, more if necessary. It's that town meeting that hires the minister, that raises the taxes to support the minister, that builds and pays for the upkeep of the church, and that seats the pews. So the pews are being seated by people who are not members of the church. So they've got the economic power in their hands, and in many ways the political power, but the church is independent, and as far as the government of the Commonwealth is, it's the boss. Now, that's not quite the story they usually tell you when you deal with colonial history in elementary school. But that's the way it was designed. Very few members of the town were members of the church. Supposedly they're to be ruled by it. And as the population increases, the problem gets worse. Now, it's complicated by the fact of what Westfield was in those years. When you think of Westfield, you think the borders of what we've got today. That was not Westfield. The original Westfield included what is today Southwick, Granville, and much of Suffield, Connecticut. By the mid-1750s, it also includes Montgomery and parts of Russell. Now let's suppose you live in Suffield, Connecticut. The church, it's out here on the corner where Meadow Street runs into Maine. You're in Suffield, Connecticut. In the days when to get to church or get anywhere else, you got to ride on horseback. Now, are you going to get up in the middle of February in Suffield, Connecticut, and get on your horse and ride that horse for, 3 hours to come to Westfield, to sit in a stone-cold church, to listen to 6 hours of sermons, to ride back in the dark? You are not happy. And yet if you don't show up, they'll fine you. Needless to say, tensions existed in the community. And the tensions every once in a while would blossom out. Now, some pastors were very good about mitigating those tensions, cooperating with the people in the town. Edward Taylor was not. Edward Taylor was an early 17th century Puritan saint. God has chosen me. I'm in charge. You question me, you're questioning God. So the struggles with him were worse. Now that's not the way, if you read the popular histories of the church, that's not the way it's described. How do we know this? How do we know there are these problems? Well, there's another set of records. There are the town meeting records from the 1760s. If you want to read them, you can go to the Westfield City Hall, and from 1766, the records are there. Now, up until 40 years ago, the records from the first days were there. I've been trying to put my hands on them for a couple of weeks now, and there's some confusion. I have been assured that they are still there somewhere. I have every reason to believe they probably are, but at the moment, people can't put their hands on them. However, we got lucky, because if any of you went to the talk on Superintendent Abernathy the other night, very interesting talk done by a young, he's not young anymore, Walter Powell, a researcher. Walter Powell did his doctoral dissertation from the records of this town. He was here as a researcher in the late 1970s, and I had always thought that his dissertation was on Taylor. I had never read it, never paid any attention to it. Personally, I didn't care that much about Taylor. But once we started looking for these records, I went to his dissertation, and lo and behold, his dissertation is Edward Taylor's Westfield, The Records of a Community. And what he did was he copied and published in his dissertation all of those missing records. So if they're really missing, we've got them in his dissertation. We've got them one other place. There's another collection of records here that we're trying to deal with. There was an amateur researcher in the 1870s and 80s called Joseph Bartlett. Bartlett, for reasons that are just not clear, decided that he was going to get a personal copy of all old records he could find in Westfield. So he spent between 20 and 30 years wandering around town, and anybody who had any old papers that would let him, he copied them into notebooks. They're little steno notepads is what they look like. For those of you old enough to remember what a steno notepad looks like. There are 39 of them. His handwriting is beautiful, easy to read. But the paper is, well, when I was a kid going to school, you had to take your own paper and pencils with you. And my father was cheap, so we went to buy the notebooks. We bought those notebooks that had the wood chips still they were brown paper, and they had the wood chips still in them. You remember those? That was the cheap paper. Well, that's what these notebooks are. They're terribly fragile 140 years later. So this past winter, the library was lucky and purchased the technical equipment, so we're in the process of digitalizing all those notebooks now. So you'll be able to get access to them. And he copied out those town records also. So they're not lost. We can get at them. All right, what do the town records tell us? Well, first of all, they tell us that when you look at the town meeting records, that Edward Taylor was in an almost constant fight with some people in town. Often over pay. Now, I said that the people in town paid his salary, but they didn't do it willingly. Now, we didn't have tax collectors in those days. People were assessed so much. And if you didn't have cash, it was so many bushels of wheat or barrels of beef or something, and you had to show up and take it to Taylor. Here's my share. Well, how about those folks down in Suffield? You think they were anxious to bring their share up here and give it to this guy? Well, they weren't. And he was constantly complaining that his pay was in arrears. And they basically didn't raise it for most of his life here. You know, you got 40, 50 years goes by. In fact, in the last 10 to 15 years of his life, they cut his pay.
Yeah, don't get any ideas.
They were trying to get him out. He was old and stubborn and he wouldn't move, and they were trying to get him out. So they cut his pay. He, at one point, got so mad at them, the way in which the church could function as a community was through communion. And for 18 months, he refused to offer communion. He refused. You don't pay me, you don't treat me well, we're not functioning, and I'm in charge. He made plans to leave a couple of times. It didn't amount to anything. He stayed right through to the end. In his later years, the original church building was much too small and much too primitive for the greatly enlarged community. And so the community decided it was going to build a new church. Well, the old church was next door to his home. He just had to walk out the front door and there was the church. And they wanted to move it. They wanted to move it closer to the centers of population. And they wanted to make it different and bigger, and he refused. Now, he's got his backers in the community, the members. So there are years of fights in the town records over building this new church. Years. Finally, when they get it built, he refused to go. He refuses to go preach in the place. Well, they send committees to appeal to him. He's now in his early 70s, and his health is bad. He don't want to do it. And by the way, they haven't helped because they've hired an assistant for him who they're paying more than they're paying him. I mean, if you read this stuff, you can recognize it's just standard infighting. You all recognize it. They're trying to get rid of the old man, and the old man won't go. Finally, he dies. And the town discovers that he has filed suit against the town for back pay and for a raise in pay that he said he'd been promised. And his son, Eldad, who's Justice of the Peace, continues the suit for years. And finally the town caves in and gives them something. So all was not sweetness and life. Now his successor is Bull. With Bull it's worse. Bull and the town fight for 14 years over pay. Because by now, and we're now up in the 1730s and 40s, the town has spread out all over the place. It is much bigger, and as I've told you, what had happened because of the mental attitude of Edward Taylor, he had not been bringing new members into the church. Remember I said that on his death there are only 14 adult males? There were 17 when he started the church 50 years earlier. He hadn't brought new members in. So Bull, with Bull, they're fighting all the time. The town is always complaining that he doesn't handle his money properly, that he's investing improperly in things, that he's spending too much on his personal property and his personal possessions. The town begins to judge whether the pastor is living a proper moral life, rather than the pastor judging the town now. Ballantyne they get along much better with. So things are better. But these fights that you see, by the way, it looks to me exactly like city council meetings at some times in the past in Westfield. There are fights over the schoolhouse and where the schoolhouse is going to be located. There are fights over seating the church. They seat the church in one year. They set up a committee to seat the church. They bring the recommendations in. They reject them. They create a second committee. They don't like the second committee, so they go to Springfield and they get a group of Springfield people to come up here and interview the population of town to seat the church. They don't like that either. They vote it down. And they don't seat the church for 3 straight years. Hiring pastors is a steady battle. They're always sending invitations out to somebody, and the records don't show, but suddenly you find in the next meeting they're sending an invitation to somebody else. To give you how crazy these town meetings were, in 1777, during the Revolutionary War, early part of the Revolutionary War, smallpox began to spread through the Continental forces, and smallpox was deadly. Now, there was a protection against smallpox. It was inoculation. But it was controversial because when you were inoculated, that meant you were contagious. So you then became dangerous to those around you. So it was very controversial. So in the spring of 1777, the town meeting voted against inoculation and created a system of fines for anyone they caught participating in inoculation. 4 months later, at a second town meeting, they voted to create a smallpox vaccination isolation house to pay a doctor to come and inoculate and to fine anybody who didn't inoculate. As I said, you read these things and you can recognize various town meetings at various times. It's nothing much has changed. What we have then are two sets of records covering the same era, providing two different perspectives on what's going on. If you're going to write a modern history, you have to work from both of them. Like Sporting Life says in the movie and play Porgy and Bess, it ain't necessarily so. History has a strange way of popping up surprises from time to time. Thank you very much. Comment, question? Yes?
So if you were a different religion, did you just not move to Westfield?
Well, in the 1600s, you would be expelled from the Commonwealth.
The whole state?
And if you didn't go, you would be killed. Quakers were killed in the Boston area. By the time we get into the 1700s, Methodists have appeared. Now, remember, we're not talking about Catholics. No Catholics are allowed. It's not allowed. In the 1700s, Methodists have begun to appear, and some Scots have begun to come in, and they are developing practices that will become known as Presbyterianism. And if you want to drive yourself nuts, you can drop back to the 17th century and try to decide read this stuff and try to figure out the difference between a Pilgrim and a Puritan and a Presbyterian. I do not think the energy's worth it. But by the 1700s, these others have begun to appear. Now, Ballantyne has to deal with them. And so in Ballantyne's journal, he's constantly talking about the separatists. That is, those people who ordinarily would have been Congregationalists who are refusing to attend the church. And what they do is they create their own church, and it's out on East Main Street. They meet in a house out there. They claimed that they were purer than the Puritans. Here's the fine point. You get to be a saint by this confession and identification. By the way, the Congregational Church, for the rest of its history, and we have membership lists for almost all the years right up to the end of the 19th and early 20th century, it's mostly females who are members. The Fowlers never joined the church. They attended. They never joined the church. The men, the women did. The Deweys didn't. The Mosleys didn't. The men didn't. Because that meant, as a man, you had to stand up there and expose your soul and let other people judge you. And these are the important people in the community, and they say, to hell with that. Now, for women of the time and place, it was not felt to be as much ego involved, all right? So you can look at church members, the Congregational Church membership lists right up to the 1920s and go down through the list of families and you'll see female names. And the male of the family is not listed as a member. You know he's attending, but he's not a member. So the separatists created their own church, and they said they were purer. How are they pure? Well, we've got these members. Okay, that gives you power in the community. What do we do about your kids? Now, in theory, your kids can't inherit that power unless they go through this same process. But what happens if they don't? Then all of a sudden, you, the bigwig in the community, your kid isn't. So they held their nose and they created something called the halfway covenant. They said, well, it's obvious God chose you. God must like the fruit of your loins. Now, they don't get all the power, but they're in. All right, that took care of the next generation. What happens with your grandkids? Because your kids, you see, didn't get fully into power. What about your grandkids? Well, now the church has got all kinds of problems trying to figure that out. So these original separatists in Westfield are the ones who said, we're going back to the beginning. We're going to be fundamentalists. You got to have the conversion. If you don't have the conversion, I don't care. And they gradually drifted and they became Baptists in town. They ultimately became Baptists. Remember, the basic principle of the Baptist was a child cannot be a member of the church. You've got to have adult baptism. Because in adult baptism, we know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. Child doesn't know. So, there are no other groups until we get into the mid-1700s. Catholics are still banned. The first Catholics who appear in any numbers, of course, you all know, are the Irish, who come in just before the famine. Actually, they began to come just before the famine, but particularly the famine. And it panicked Massachusetts and Westfield. When the Westfield Catholic community decided they were going to have a church, they started constructing St. Mary's. Yeah. And a mob developed in town, went down to burn St. Mary's to the ground. And the famous story here in town is that Hiram Hull, who was the biggest employer in the whip factory in town, went down to face the mob, and essentially what he is supposed to have done is face the mob and said, I know you, Bill, you work for me, and I know you, John, you work for me, and if you want to continue working for me, go home. That's the story anyway, and the church was not burned. So it was tough up until pretty late in the 19th century, and even then, as I began my comments this afternoon, it was difficult if you were not Yankee. It was difficult in Massachusetts to have any real influence in communities, particularly these rural ones. Yeah.
So, in listening to what you say here, you've got two sides to the story. I grew up in Southwick. I'm a member of the Southwick Congregational Church. I know the Southwick side of the story, but I don't know the Westfield side. And I'm wondering, do they mention anything about when Southwick wanted to create their own?
Yeah, we have in the town records, and of course we have the documents where Westfield gave permission for Southwick to go. The original documents are here.
But do the ministers have a record? And what
That I don't know, because I haven't looked at those later ministers' records. So I don't know that. I know from the town records we have the record. Because, I mean, obviously those in Southwick have got a real problem. They're too far away from the center of power. And ultimately that's what happened with Montgomery and Russell. They're too far away. And so they ultimately are split off. But there is some controversy over it. Yeah.
What year was that they all started splitting off? Do you know?
Southwick,
1773.
yeah.
But then you had 1776. Now, before that time, the church had all the power.
Well, its power is declining. By the time you get to the 1770s, as I've said, the population has gotten so much larger in town, and the membership in the church has gotten so small as a percentage of the total population that it doesn't have the power that it had a century earlier. It just doesn't have it. But it's still, depending on the pastor and depending upon the community, it can still have a very important influence in the community. Yeah. Cindy, you?
Yeah, does the journal talk about Reverend Bull's work, missionary work with the Houstonic Indians involved?
I can't answer that. I have not read through the journal.
We know that he did that, but we don't know if he was successful or not.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.